Pre-Stonewall America, the gay liberation movement in the first half of the 20th century. First, I just want to talk about the acronym LGBT, and I reference it several times throughout this presentation and in my paper as well, just to make sure that everyone knows the people that we're talking about when we use the phrasing LGBT. So we got lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered people. This is intended to emphasize a diversity of both sexuality and gender identity based cultures, and is sometimes used to refer to anyone who is non-heterosexual or is non-cisgender. So anyone that does not self-identify as a heterosexual and may not identify with the gender that they were initially born with. So that's the people that we're talking about when I use LGBT. So I just have a little video here that goes over just a little blip about the Stonewall riots themselves. It's actually a theatrical trailer for a PBS publication about Stonewall. So just to give you a little idea about what Stonewall is, just to get things started, check this out. So, as the film shows, the Stonewall Riots was the watershed moment that brought the gay liberation movement into mainstream America. It occurred in June 1969 in Greenwich Village in New York City. After the Stonewall uprising and riots, the resistance movement becomes more organized, more effective, and more visible. But the LGBT community also sought to understand and establish their own history and identity. So, was the Stonewall Riots really the beginning of the gay liberation movement? That was the main goal of the research that I have conducted, was to find out if Stonewall was the beginning, or, how relevant was Stonewall to the gay liberation movement as a whole. And what I found out is that the impact of the first half of the 20th century had immense influence on what would become the modern gay liberation movement. So, although the singular event of the Stonewall riots that occurred in New York City in 1969 is often credited with being the beginning of the gay liberation movement, the actions and happenings of homosexuals in America in the first half of the 20th century had immeasurable influence on what would become the modern gay liberation movement. So what about the 1940s and 50s? What I have discovered through my research is that members of the LGBT community, as we consider them today, came together during the 1940s and 50s to create a specific uniform identity that encompassed numerous races, genders, classes, education levels of people, all that, for the first time in history, identified themselves as a minority. And the members of this newly identified group of Americans also recognized the need to fight for the civil rights of this minority. So all of these things were happening in the 1940s and 50s. And as we get further into this presentation, you'll see how those things were happening. But lots of stuff happening in the 2 decades before the Stonewall riots. What I've concluded is that the study of these decades is imperative to understanding how the gay liberation movement got its momentum. Had the formation of the identity of this group of people not happened in the 1940s and 50s, the Stonewall riots themselves may never have occurred. So my paper starts with just some information about evolving terminology that was happening late in the 19th century. Basically, the wording changed for identifying homosexual people from sodomy to using the word homosexual. So prior to 1868, when the homosexual was developed by a German-Hungarian activist, people who were attracted and engaged in sexual acts with someone of the same sex were often referred to as sodomy. Those acts were considered sodomy. But after 1868, lots of people started to use the word homosexual. So before this time, terminology did not exist that specifically encompassed the group of people that are now identified as members of the LGBT society. So with the new word homosexual, that helps to show a changing tide in viewing the homosexual. So this terminology and changing views says that at the end of the 19th century, an evolution in classifying homosexuals was occurring, and the creation of the word homosexual is evidence of this. During this period, developments occurred to encompass the notion that homosexuals were people with a medical problem rather than people with a solely criminal nature who participated in deviant activity. Now, this is huge in understanding how the first half of the 20th century is going to change dramatically in viewing the homosexual. For the first time ever, people are looking at homosexuals from a scientific standpoint instead of a moral or religious standpoint, or from a criminal standpoint, where the activities that they are participating in were considered deviant and criminal. Now, much of this change in thought was happening because of sexologists, psychiatrists, and other mental health professionals during this time period. And these changes would eventually have an impact on how society as a whole viewed homosexuals and the need for groups to organize to lobby together for the emancipation of the LGBT community. So this scientific influence eventually made its way to the military, and World War II became a time of persecution of homosexuals and the first official United States military policy regarding them. So the change in thought from addressing homosexuals as deviants to people who had a medical problem is filtering through lots of parts of the American culture and eventually makes its way into the military. So we're going to see later on how that's going to affect World War II. So prior to World War II, in the years just before then, the Selective Service had not been concerned with identifying people and their sexual orientation and when screening people for military service. So in all the wars prior to World War II, there was no weeding out of people who were homosexuals. So that was a brand new policy that was implemented in 1940 and 1941 prior to the United States going into World War II. But that, again, is showing evidence that the influence of the medical community viewing homosexuals as people with a medical problem is something that is important to the military. So the military officials had the mindset that homosexuals would make poor combat soldiers and that their presence in units would threaten morale and discipline. Now, the military also thought that if they could eliminate what would be medical issues after the war, or, when people got out of the military, if they could eliminate those medical problems prior to, that could save them money. So a lot of this was approached in a fiscal way that the medical community did have influence on. So some other groups that were excluded at this time, before World War II, were women and blacks in some branches of the military. Not all of the branches excluded blacks, but several did. But the military eventually helps to create the first notion of a group identity for homosexuals. So even though this pre-war exclusion demonstrates a level of discrimination towards homosexuals, suddenly those attracted to members of the same sex had an identity, at least in the eyes of the military. So finally, you're grouping these people together. But once the war actually begins, the manpower needs take precedent over the stringent investigation into sexual identity, which had been happening in 1940 and 1941. What happens when the draft begins is that it starts to bring people from all areas of the country together, from small town, rural places that without the war and without the draft never would have met, never would have socialized together, and that brings about a huge change in homosexual group identity. So the sad reality, though, of anybody that made it into the military and was a homosexual was the risk of having a blue discharge, which was not honorable, not dishonorable. It was an undesirable discharge. And someone didn't even have to actually be caught in a homosexual act to have this discharge. Someone could just suspect that they were. And it's estimated that 10,000 service members were given this discharge. Most of them were men. Many veterans who received this discharge were denied access to numerous GI benefits, such as home loans, medical care, pension, burial rights, lots of different things that the GI benefit program was offering, heterosexual veterans or homosexuals who were not identified and given these blue discharges. So this was a very discriminatory discharge from the military, and it had repercussions not only in the military, but once these veterans returned to civilian life, it had a huge effect on their lives and ability to find jobs and buy houses and, lots of different things with that. So the war experiences changes things. The veterans of World War II were the first generation of gay men and women to experience such rapid, dramatic, and widespread changes in their lives as homosexuals. Evidence of this is that one of the very first organized groups of homosexuals in America was established by a group of ex-GIs in New York called the Veterans Benevolent Association, which was established in 1948. So, the coming together of all these different people from all areas of the country who are now self-identifying as members of the LGBT community is has had a huge impact on the people's ability to self-identify as that. So after the war ended, many gay veterans chose not to return to their small town and rural homes, but remain in urban settings where LGBT subcultures were thriving. So it's like they had this opportunity with the war to have this newfound sexual identity, and it made it impossible for many of them to even fathom returning back to the lives and homes that they knew before and all of the expectations of them from their hometown. So many of them flocked to cities like San Francisco and New York, where in the 1950s we'll see how those cities were influential on political activism for the LGBT community. After the war, though, much of America wants to return to normal. World War II has shaken every fabric of American society, not just, homosexuals, but lots of things, were were changed because of this war. So people thought that if they returned to more common and conservative values that they had before the war, that would help to bring America back into more of a sense of normal. So some of those conservative values were heterosexuality, traditional gender roles in home and work, which had changed during the war as well, the nuclear family of a mom and dad and kids. And people, thought that this could help the country recover from the effects of the war. But the 1950s is an era where the LGBT American would be subjected to unscrupulous amounts of investigation and persecution by the federal government. Because members of the LGBT community did not adhere to these conservative values that were, what a majority of Americans thought were normal, and their lives were viewed as deviant, that subjected them to large amounts of persecution from the government and employers, and just right on down the line. So but in the 1950s, activist groups really start to emerge, and two of the most influential were the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society. So the DOB, as we call it, is the predominantly female group. The Mattachine is predominantly male. Both of these groups were established in California. The DOB established in San Francisco, Mattachine in Los Angeles. The Mattachine initially had a much more, idea that they wanted to organize their group to be politically active. But the Daughters of Bilitis, not so much. It began more as a social club for women that eventually led them to political activism, but it wasn't their initial goal. But some of the impacts of these activist groups, both of the creation of them demonstrates how more and more people were self-identifying as members of the LGBT sector of society and the need for political activism. Many people who were personally involved in these groups in the 50s would eventually become involved in the Stonewall riots themselves and the days, weeks, months, years immediately after that. So these groups were able to provide information about politically relevant topics to countless people. So they were just getting the word out about, hey, the group of people that we are and consider ourselves part of, we exist, we're not going anywhere, and that there was a need for the civil rights that the government was going to have to address for this group of people. So huge impact that these groups had on what would become the liberation movement. So one of the most concrete things that happened in the 1950s was the Supreme Court decision in 1958 of One Incorporated versus Olison. One Incorporated was an organization that was established in Los Angeles, and they had a publication called One Magazine that provided homosexual relevant information to people throughout the country. So the Los Angeles postmaster, who was Olison, considers this homosexual content to be obscene. He eventually confiscated magazines and because he considered them obscene and didn't feel that they should be mailed through the United States Postal Service. So in 1958, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that homosexual content alone was not obscene. So just the fact that they're producing this magazine with information with homosexual relevant topics, many of them political, that alone did not make the magazine obscene, and therefore it could be sent through the United States Postal Service. This Supreme Court decision was huge for the legal precedent of LGBT people, and this was the first court decision that specifically identified LGBT people as a sector of American people and as a minority. So, the activist groups that were happening in California and New York at this time had, huge influence on what would become the gay liberation movement in the 1960s. So, and this picture here is the cover of one of the magazines that was initially confiscated by the Los Angeles postmaster. I just thought it was interesting that it had homosexual marriage with a question mark. And, with the political landscape right now, so one of the most important LGBT issues going on right now is about homosexual marriage. So, and as you can see, this was published in August of 1953. So it's been an ongoing thing. So what's all this mean? basically what I have concluded in my research is that without the 1940s and 50s and that generation of people, the personal experiences that they had, that they would bring from their lives, would eventually lead to the modern gay liberation movement. So yes, Stonewall gets a lot of the credit about being the beginning, but really the beginning was happening long before that. And without these people doing the things that they did, living the lives that they lived, the personal experiences that they had in the 1940s and 50s, the Stonewall riots would never have had the opportunity to occur at all. So yes, Stonewall was important. Yes, Stonewall was influential in bringing the gay rights movement into much of mainstream America. There were things, lots of things, that were happening prior to this that became relevant to Stonewall and the gay liberation movement as well. So the last little thing I've included on this is just an interesting video from CBS in 1967 that just shows that even with the strides of political activism done in the 1940s and 50s, that without Stonewall, much of the civil rights that LGBT Americans have won in recent decades would not have been possible. So this was a CBS documentary done by Mike Wallace in 1967. It's just a little 2-minute blurb of it, but it just gives you an idea of even where the country was in 1967 in regard to homosexuals. So I hope that you found this information interesting as I did. And once it's over, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks for watching.